Valerie Sterling met her 58th birthday in a burgundy dress with a quiet, almost serene expression. Those who had known her a long time would say she always knew how to keep her composure. Those who truly knew her, and there were only 2 or 3 of them, would say something else entirely. She knew how to keep much more than just her composure. She chose the restaurant herself, not because there was no one else to do it, simply because she was used to it. If you want something done right, do it yourself. 32 years next to Garrison Sterling had honed this skill into an automated reflex. Menus, seating charts, fresh floral arrangements on the tables, soft background music. Valerie thought through all of this herself between her corporate job, phone calls, and the countless household chores that somehow always ended up being her responsibility. The venue was excellent. Second floor, large windows overlooking a historic downtown Chicago park, November outside. Bare trees, early twilight, street lamps, warm and bright inside, with about 40 guests. Former colleagues from the engineering firm, a few neighbors they had been friends with for years, her college best friend Celeste, the very same Celeste whom Garrison never liked, calling her a bore, and always finding an excuse to keep Valerie from meeting up with her. But tonight was a milestone birthday, and Valerie invited whoever she wanted. Garrison showed up dressed to the nines. Dark suit, crisp white shirt, silk tie. He knew how to dress. That was always his trademark. He knew how to enter a room so people noticed him, knew how to speak so people listened. This had seemed attractive to Valerie 32 years ago when they met at the manufacturing plant. She was a process engineer. He was the head of procurement, cheerful, confident, full of grand gestures and big promises. Big promises, as it turned out later, were something he was much better at making than keeping. But that realization came later. Next to Garrison, as always, sat his mother, Beatrice, 78 years old. Petite, withered, with sharp eyes and the perpetual look of a person who believed everyone around her owed her something. She arrived fully decked out. A new dark dress, a fresh blowout, a vintage brooch. Valerie knew that brooch. Beatrice only wore it for special occasions. Garrison's wedding, his father's funeral, the baptism of her grandson from Garrison's first marriage. That marriage ended 2 decades ago, long before Valerie came into the picture. Yet her mother-in-law still mentioned that first wife with a nostalgia she never explained out loud. She just gave that specific look. Roxanne, Garrison's younger sister, 42, arrived without her husband. Vance, she mentioned in passing, was under the weather. Roxanne was one of those people who knew how to stay silent so eloquently that her silence became a separate conversation. She barely looked at Valerie the entire evening. She looked at her brother, her mother, the table, anywhere but at the birthday woman. Valerie noticed this. She had a talent for noticing details. 30 years of engineering and financial work had trained her to see not what was being shown, but what was actually there. The evening started well. Francine, a senior colleague from the firm, gave a touching toast, sharing stories from the late 90s when the company almost shut down, and they sat without pay for 3 months. Valerie had managed to keep the strictest ledger of departmental expenses without ever panicking out loud. Celeste added a funny anecdote about their college days. Colleagues laughed. Valerie smiled, not a fake smile, but the way one smiles when hearing something genuine. At the adjacent table, Garrison checked his phone several times under the tablecloth, cautiously, like a student during an exam. Valerie saw this out of the corner of her eye. She had long mastered the art of seeing him out of the corner of her eye. It was a habit developed naturally, without intent, simply over the decades. Beatrice whispered something to Roxanne, who nodded with a smirk. Valerie took a sip of her wine and thought about how she noticed all of this, yet intentionally refrained from piecing the puzzle together right away. Sometimes the puzzle puts itself together when the time is right, and there is no need to rush it. She was 58. She had lived with Garrison for 32 years. They had no children. It just never happened. It had been a prolonged ache that Valerie had long ago processed into something else, something less sharp, more like a quiet scar. Beatrice never let the subject drop. Never. For years, at every family gathering and every phone call, well, childless is how you live. Garrison deserves to carry on his line. Our family needs an heir. Valerie used to reply politely, then silently, and eventually stopped replying altogether. She just listened, nodded, and thought about her own matters. Thinking about her own matters was a crucial detail. She had thought a lot about her own matters all these years, alongside the family routines, the household, and Garrison's various business ventures that he constantly launched and abandoned, alongside his business partners whom she cooked dinners for, alongside his debts that she quietly paid off without throwing a fit, simply because a scandal always costs more than the debt itself if you calculate nerve cells at a fair exchange rate. Valerie Sterling knew how to calculate. It was her natural gift. enhanced by her education and sharpened by 30 years of practice. She had worked as a cost estimator, then a financial analyst, and finally as the head of the economic planning department at a major industrial corporation. Numbers were never abstract to her. They were the language she thought in an honest language, devoid of emotions and unnecessary words. That was exactly why, 3 years ago, she started a folder. A dark brown file folder, frayed at the corners, unlabeled, resting in the bottom drawer of her desk under a stack of old architectural magazines. Garrison never opened the bottom drawer of her desk. He rarely entered her home office at all, finding the space incredibly dull. Your papers, your accounting. Let her crunch her numbers. How the folder came to be is a separate story. Not a single event, but a series of moments stacking up over a few years. The first was 5 years ago when Garrison brought home documents to refinance his luxury SUV and asked Valerie to simply sign them. "Everything is ready," the attorney handled it, he said. Valerie read them. The documents did not say what he claimed. There was a hidden loan she knew nothing about. She signed a completely different paper, one she drafted right there by hand, specifying the exact amount and repayment terms as a personal loan. Garrison grimaced but signed it. He needed her money, and he understood that just as clearly as she did. The second was when she accidentally found a restaurant receipt for two in his jacket pocket, dated on a day he supposedly spent at a regional business conference. She didn't make a scene. She merely took a photo of the receipt and put her phone back in her purse. The third was when Beatrice casually dropped a phrase during a conversation that she clearly never meant to say out loud. "Well, never mind, Gary. Just be patient a little longer." "Be patient for what?" Valerie asked directly. Her mother-in-law grew flustered and changed the subject, but the words were spoken. They lingered. After the third incident, Valerie called Mitchell Prescott. Mitchell was a college peer, not a close friend, but someone with whom she had maintained a steady, trusting professional relationship for 40 years. He had become a corporate and property lawyer, sharp, dry, devoid of poetry. He was exactly the kind of person she needed right now. They met in his modest downtown office without unnecessary pleasantries. Valerie laid out the situation evenly, just like reporting at a board meeting. What was happening, what raised questions, what needed verifying. Mitchell listened, took notes, asked brief, precise questions, and offered no pity. She hadn't asked for any. "The condo," he said first. "Yours or joint?" "Mine," Valerie replied. "Inherited from my mother before the marriage." "Documents in order?" "Yes." "Certificate of inheritance. Title in my name. No liens." Mitchell nodded and made a note. "The lake house in Wisconsin was bought during the marriage. With money we both contributed, but I have bank statements showing I transferred funds from my personal account." He had practically nothing in his account back then. He was just exiting another failed venture. "Whose name is on the deed?" "His," he insisted. He said a man should be the master of the property. Mitchell looked up. "That can be fixed," he said, "but it will take time and precision. Do you have promissory notes for the loans?" Valerie pulled several sheets from her bag. Mitchell reviewed them and nodded again. "Good. Let's start with an inventory." For 3 years, they worked quietly, without rushing, without making a sound. Valerie visited Mitchell once a month, sometimes more. They drafted, refined, and documented. Simultaneously, another process was underway, the one Valerie managed herself in the bottom drawer of her desk, inside the unlabeled folder. Through all those 3 years, she continued to live as usual. Woke up, cooked, went to work, hosted Beatrice on Sundays, transferred money for Roxanne's home renovations because Garrison asked, claiming his sister was struggling. She met Celeste once a month on neutral territory. Nothing changed on the outside. Inside, everything changed. One day, Celeste asked her bluntly. She had a knack for asking without beating around the bush. "Valerie, is there someone else?" Valerie paused for a second. "Most likely." "And you?" "I am working on it," Valerie said simply. Celeste looked at her with a long gaze. "Doesn't it hurt?" "It hurt before," Valerie replied. "Now it is just information." This was the truth. Not a defense mechanism, not a facade, the absolute truth. Because by that point she already knew enough. She knew some things not only about Garrison's personal life, but also about something else, something he himself didn't fully realize yet and would only discover at the precise right moment. Where this knowledge came from is yet another story. It began not 3 years ago, but much earlier. Over 7 years ago, Garrison involved her in a minor business matter. He needed her name and credentials to bid on a municipal contract. A small company, construction contracting, a purely technical formality. You are not participating in anything, just a signature. Valerie read the documents, spotted a discrepancy, and refused to sign. Garrison was furious for 3 days. She remained silent. On the 4th day, he found an alternative solution, and the story seemed to end there. But Valerie never forgot. She rarely forgot anything. She kept an eye on that specific company, not out of malice, but purely out of an analyst's habit. When you spot a discrepancy, it is interesting to understand what lies beneath it. What she found a few months later was minor on its own. But combined with what surfaced a year later, and with what her old acquaintance, a forensic auditor named Arthur Gable, uncovered at her quiet request, a complete picture emerged. It wasn't exactly a criminal saga. No, it was more of an administrative and regulatory scheme. Violations in executing state bids, underreporting actual work volumes in financial statements, and several signatures on documents that heavily contradicted reality. Garrison was one of the participants. Not the mastermind, but a key player. This happened years ago. The statute of limitations for the administrative penalties had expired, but the documents remained, and the knowledge of their existence remained too. Valerie never intended to use these papers as a weapon. She filed them in the folder just to have them, just to see the full picture. When she showed the copies to Mitchell, the lawyer stared at them for a long time and said a single word: insurance. Exactly, Valerie replied. 2 years later, Mitchell called her with a brief question. The lake house. Are you ready to transfer the deed to your name? Yes. Listen then. Garrison owes you a massive debt. You mentioned he borrowed money from you under a promissory note 3 years ago. The amount covers the appraised value of the lake house. Valerie pulled out her calculations. It matched almost perfectly. Then we can execute a deed in lieu of debt. He transfers the property to you to settle what he owes. Voluntarily. He will agree if we present it correctly, Mitchell said. He needs to see that this is much cheaper than paying the debt in cash. She presented it correctly. Garrison agreed without reading it. He hated reading legal documents anyway. He preferred to pretend he understood everything and sign quickly, so as not to appear slow. It was an old habit of his that Valerie had studied flawlessly. The lake house had been in her name for a year. Garrison, by all appearances, still considered it marital property. He considered many things marital property without asking questions or checking records, simply out of a habit of assuming everything in his life belonged to him. The Chicago Gold Coast condo was hers. He knew that. She never hid it, but he presumably believed that 32 years of marriage changed something in a legal sense. It did not. Valerie knew this for a fact. The lake house was hers. He didn't know this, assuming it was their shared family retreat. The personal bank account he had no idea about was also entirely hers. These 3 components formed a picture that Valerie examined in solitude during long evenings, while Garrison was out at business dinners. The picture was clear, meticulous, and free of unnecessary elements. All this time, she didn't obsess over what would happen or construct wild scenarios. She just lived and prepared calmly, without rushing. The way experienced surgeons prepare for an operation, not because they are eager to cut, but because they know the moment will come and they must be ready. The moment arrived in November at her birthday dinner, but that didn't happen overnight either. First came August. In August, Valerie returned from the lake house alone. Garrison was supposed to follow later, claiming he was delayed by something. She walked into the apartment and instantly knew someone had been there. Not a burglar. Garrison always had a key. Simply put, someone had carefully moved items on the shelves. Valerie, who out of an engineer's habit knew the exact coordinates of every object in her home, sensed it immediately. She looked at the bottom drawer of her desk. There was no lock. She had never installed one, believing it would only attract unwanted attention. The folder was positioned differently, just a fraction of an inch off. This meant he had looked. He had found the folder, read it, or at least skimmed it. Valerie stood in her home office for a second. Then she walked to the kitchen, turned on the kettle, and called Mitchell. Mitch, he saw the folder. A pause. Everything? Presumably. How long ago? Today, while I was gone. Another brief pause. Then we accelerate, he said. Is there anything left to finalize before he makes a move? No, Valerie said. Everything is filed. Then we wait. We wait, she agreed. She poured her tea, sat by the kitchen window, looked at the autumn courtyard, and thought. She wondered what exactly he had seen in the folder. The lake house deeds, the promissory notes, or what lay at the very bottom beneath the paper clips. Most likely all of it. He could read fast when he wanted to. She wondered what he would do now. She felt no fear. It was slightly strange. A different person would probably be terrified. But Valerie Sterling had spent 30 years navigating corporate economics, surviving several market crashes, 2 rounds of massive layoffs, and 3 changes in corporate ownership. In her experience, fear was only a reaction to the unknown. There was almost no unknown left. For the next 3 months, Garrison behaved strangely. He was overly attentive, overly polite, stripped of his usual irritability. He brought home flowers. For the first time in years, he suggested they take a trip somewhere together. He claimed they needed to socialize more. Valerie accepted all of this with an impassive face, thanked him, and asked no questions. She figured he was cooking something up. Let him cook. Beatrice suddenly started calling more frequently in September. Her voice was warm, almost affectionate, which in itself was a massive red flag. Her mother-in-law only knew how to be affectionate when she needed something badly or when things were going exceptionally well for her. She didn't need anything specific right now. That meant something was going exceptionally well. Roxanne, during a family dinner in October, shot her brother that specific smirk, twice the one that clearly meant, "We know something you don't." Valerie saw all of this, piecing it together and yet refusing to rush the final image. The picture was clear enough already. In early November, Mitchell called her himself. "Valerie, there is something you need to know." Listening. "I made some discreet inquiries. It's a delicate matter. Garrison has a woman. Younger, works in the same industry. Construction procurement. Her name is Vanessa. She is 33. Pause. Has it been going on long?" Valerie asked evenly. "From the looks of it, around 2 years. But that's not all. Go on. She is pregnant. About 5 or 6 months along, according to my sources." Valerie looked out the window. A November courtyard, bare branches, a slate gray sky. "Understood," she said. "Valerie, how are you holding up?" "I am working, Mitch," she replied, just like always. She hung up and sat in the silence of her office for a long time. She wasn't thinking about the fact that he had another woman. She was thinking about something else. 5 months meant August. That meant when he found her folder, he already knew about the pregnancy, which meant the trips, the flowers, the talk about socializing more. None of it was an attempt to reconcile. It was preparation for a completely different exit strategy. She pulled out a notepad, jotted down a column of action items, stared at it, closed it, and called Mitchell back. "Mitch, that document we drafted for the worst-case scenario. Is it ready?" "Ready. Sitting in my safe." "Good. Hold on to it just a little longer." "How long?" "Until the birthday dinner," she said. A brief, surprised pause. "You think he'll time it for your birthday?" "I think," Valerie said. "That is exactly what he will do. He has always loved theatrical moments." Mitchell fell silent for a moment. "All right," he said. "I will be on standby." Valerie put her phone away, stood up, and walked to the window. The November weather outside was dark and damp. She stared at the courtyard and thought about how, in a few weeks, everything would change. That 32 years would end not quietly and gradually, as she might have once assumed, but exactly the way men like Garrison end things. With a grand gesture, with special effects, with an audience. Fine. She was ready for that. She was ready for the rest of it, too. She began preparing the birthday dinner in a calm, almost business-like mood. The restaurant, the menu, the seating chart, all the details handled personally. Garrison offered to take charge of the toasts. She thanked him and didn't object. Let him handle the toasts. Let him set up his grand effect. She had been setting up hers for a long time. Celeste called a week before the party. "Valerie, I have a feeling something is going to happen at this dinner. He's plotting something." "I know," Valerie said. "And you?" "I will be ready." "Val," Celeste said, and her voice held genuine alarm. "Are you sure? This is 32 years we are talking about." "Exactly," Valerie replied. 32 years is a very long time to prepare properly. She did one more thing a week before the birthday. She organized her documents, not frantically but methodically as always. Sorted into folders, filed by date, checking every single page. The promissory notes were in place. The personal bank statements were in place. The lake house deeds were in place. The documents at the very bottom were also in place. She sat at her desk until midnight. A desk lamp, absolute silence, stacks of paper. Garrison had been asleep for hours. He always went to bed early when something important was scheduled for the next day. "I need my sleep before serious business," he would always say. He slept soundly. Valerie looked at the documents and thought, 3 years of work, 3 years of quiet, meticulous preparation. No sudden movements, no tears, no ultimatums. Just one item after another, one paper after another, one conversation with Mitchell after another. She sometimes wondered, what if none of this existed? What if she, like other women in similar situations, had simply cried, demanded, begged? Nothing would have changed. The condo would have remained hers, yes. Everything was clean there from the start. But the lake house would have gone to him. The money from the loans he would have contested. The rest as well. People who don't read legal documents themselves have a talent for finding people who will read them on their behalf when someone else's assets are on the line. She closed the folder, put it in the drawer, turned off the lamp, went into the kitchen, poured some water, and stood by the dark window thinking of simple things. About the fact that Celeste, whom she hadn't seen since August, would be at the dinner tomorrow. That Francine would bring her famous hand-drawn greeting card. She drew one for everyone on their milestone birthdays. It was her tradition. And that after all this, after the restaurant, after everything that was going to happen, she would drive back to her own home and, probably for the first time in a very long time, get a proper night's sleep. That thought was unexpectedly pleasant. On the day of the dinner, she put on the burgundy dress. Not because burgundy symbolized anything, it just suited her. She looked in the mirror, fixed her hair, and grabbed her clutch. Inside the clutch, beneath her makeup bag and wallet, lay her phone. On the phone, a saved voicemail from Mitchell. "Everything is ready. Awaiting your signal." She left the apartment, locked the door, took the elevator down, got into her car, and drove to her own birthday dinner with that quiet, almost serene expression that everyone around her mistook for calmness. Only she knew it wasn't calmness. It was readiness. The restaurant greeted her with warmth and the scent of fresh flowers. She had ordered white chrysanthemums for every table. They stood in low vases, elegant and understated, completely unpretentious. The guests were already gathering. The coat check buzzed with voices. Servers in dark aprons arranged wine glasses with the professional stoicism inherent to people accustomed to other people's celebrations. Valerie walked in, and the first person she saw was Celeste. Celeste was already seated at a table in her signature dark green blazer, looking at the birthday woman the way one looks at someone they deeply respect while simultaneously fearing for them. Valerie gave a microscopic, reassuring shake of her head. Celeste nodded back and reached for her wine glass. Francine was standing by the window holding her card, the hand-drawn one as always. Watercolor autumn leaves, flawless penmanship inside. Francine had been making these cards for everyone's major milestones for 20 years. It was one of those tiny consistencies that make life bearable. Valerie hugged her, took the card, and thanked her. Warmly, briefly, without unnecessary words. Garrison appeared almost immediately after her. He arrived separately, claiming a minor errand on the way, which was yet another signal Valerie mentally filed away without comment. He walked into the hall with that specific demeanor she knew by heart. Shoulders slightly squared, a gaze sweeping the room with a profound sense of entitlement to everyone's attention. A faint smile, not joyous but rather smug, like a man harboring a secret and already savoring the moment of its grand reveal. For 32 years she had observed this demeanor, and for 32 years she had interpreted it correctly. Beatrice walked beside her son, leaning on his arm, not because she had trouble walking, but because she loved demonstrating her closeness to him in public spaces. She was dressed to the nines, vintage brooch in place, hair freshly styled. She kissed Valerie on the cheek dryly, mechanically, exactly the way she always kissed her. Devoid of warmth but lacking overt hostility. Just a ritual to be completed. Then she immediately drifted over to Roxanne, initiating that hushed, shoulder-to-shoulder whispering that Valerie had long stopped trying to decipher. Not because she couldn't, but because the overarching theme was obvious without the details. Roxanne looked slightly tense, but it was a specific kind of tension. Not anxious, but anticipatory, like a theater-goer who knows the third act contains a massive plot twist and cannot wait to watch it unfold. She sat next to her mother, leaning in frequently, her movements radiating something scripted and rehearsed. The evening unfolded wonderfully. Genuinely wonderfully, in that lively, authentic way where people don't pretend to have a good time but actually talk, laugh, and reach across the table to connect. Francine gave her toast. Long, slightly rambling, full of tangents, but incredibly memorable because it contained the real Valerie. Not the polished hostess, but the woman who, in 1995, kept the department's expense ledger in a spiral notebook because the mainframe crashed and no one even noticed the difference. The colleagues laughed. Valerie laughed too. And it wasn't a performance for the crowd. It was a real laugh. Because the story was real, and because these people had known her for decades, without the sugarcoating. Meanwhile, Garrison sat with his wine glass, staring just above everyone's heads, looking the way people do when they are entirely absorbed in their own narrative while everyone else discusses something irrelevant. Once, he checked his phone under the table, stared at the screen, and put it away. He did it a second time. Valerie observed this calmly, the way one watches a familiar weather pattern without surprise, without irritation, just logging the data. At a table in the back sat a younger woman Valerie didn't know, blonde, with a rounding belly that even her loose, dark blazer couldn't fully conceal. Valerie visually estimated the timeline and found it matched Mitchell's intel perfectly. The woman kept quiet, didn't engage in conversation with strangers, and shot multiple glances toward Garrison. Those glances were a mix of expectation and a sort of childlike anxiety, the anxiety of someone dragged into someone else's script without fully understanding her own role. Garrison had explained her presence to Valerie the day before. Casually, invited Vanessa from corporate contacts. She's new in town. Felt awkward leaving her off the list. Valerie didn't object. Why object when everything was already crystal clear? Celeste, seated diagonally from Valerie, cast one long, questioning glance in her direction, eyes darting to the back table. Then back to Valerie. Valerie gave a microscopic shake of her head. Not now. Later. Celeste understood and gripped her wine glass. About an hour in, when the toasts had cycled through a second time and the conversations grew louder and looser, Garrison stood up. He knew how to stand up with a glass so that every eye locked onto him. It was a standalone skill, polished over years of corporate retreats and banquets. Straighten the spine just enough, lift the chin to the exact angle that reads as dignified rather than arrogant, pause at the precise right moment, neither rushing nor dragging it out. The room quieted down on its own, without him asking. Several guests raised their glasses, anticipating the toast. I want to say a few words about Valerie, he began, employing his projected, resonant voice, the very same voice she had heard in endless variations over 32 years. About the woman I have shared more than 30 years of my life with. One of the coworkers smiled. Francine winked at Valerie. Valerie held her glass and smiled the way one smiles when expecting something wonderful, calmly, with mild interest, unhurried. 32 years, Garrison said, his tone turning a fraction more solemn, acquiring that specific timbre men like him use when they want their words to sound much heavier than they actually are. In that time, a lot changes. People change, circumstances change, feelings change. I have always valued honesty, and tonight, on your day, Valerie, at your milestone celebration, I want to be entirely honest. Something in the room shifted. Not the noise level, but the atmosphere. As if the temperature had imperceptibly dropped a few degrees. Everyone felt it simultaneously, even though no one yet understood why. Francine's smile faded. Celeste slowly lowered her glass to the tablecloth. Garrison straightened his posture even more, puffing up right before the grand finale, the very line he had taken the stage to deliver, and he spoke with crystal clarity into the absolute silence, ensuring every corner of the room heard him. We are getting a divorce. I have another woman, and she is expecting my child. He nodded toward the back table, where Vanessa was sitting, and then looked back at his wife with the expression of a man who had waited an eternity for this moment and finally exhaled. The silence was so absolute that Valerie could hear a car tire splashing through a puddle on the wet asphalt outside, and then came the clapping. Beatrice was the first to clap. Loudly, enthusiastically, with the demeanor of someone who had finally received something long promised, something she was fully entitled to and had been delayed for far too long. There wasn't malicious gloating in her applause. It was something worse, profound relief, as if she had been carrying a heavy burden for 32 years, and it had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Roxanne joined in immediately. Quick, confident claps, wearing the same smirk Valerie had seen on her face all evening, the nature of which was now undeniably clear. Roxanne knew. She had known all along, known for ages, and was clapping the way an audience claps when the lead actor delivers the highly anticipated catchphrase. The young woman at the back table also started clapping, clumsily, with a slight delay, like someone who was instructed on what to do but still felt terribly awkward executing it. 3 pairs of hands in a room of 40 people. The other 40 guests sat in stunned silence. Francine stared at Garrison with an expression Valerie logged in her peripheral vision as a blend of sheer shock and absolute disgust. Colleagues at the tables froze in that specific brand of acute discomfort where nobody knows where to look or what to do with their hands. Several people slowly lowered their glasses. One of the business partners, invited by Garrison himself, slowly and deliberately placed his champagne flute on the linen cloth with the look of a man who had just made a definitive internal business decision. Beatrice announced loudly, not bothering to lower her voice, ensuring the whole room heard. Finally, my son has earned a real family. Valerie looked at her mother-in-law, then at Roxanne, then at Garrison. Garrison stood there, glass still raised, staring at her with defiance, but also with something else, the immense relief of a man who had waited so long for permission to leave and had finally been granted it. She took a sip of her wine. Slowly, calmly, she placed the glass back down onto the exact same damp ring on the tablecloth. She stood up. The room was dead silent, and 40 pairs of eyes were fixed on her. Curious, sympathetic, completely lost, plus one triumphant gaze she had memorized over 3 decades. She did exactly what no one in that room expected her to do. She smiled. Not a hysterical smile. Not a twisted grimace. Not a brave smile fighting back tears. A calm, almost soft smile. The kind of smile a person gets when everything has finally clicked into the exact place it was always supposed to be. Then she spoke. Quietly but distinctly, so that in the total silence of the hall, everyone heard her. Well, I have been preparing for this day for a very long time. Now it is your turn to learn the truth. The room didn't understand. Several people exchanged baffled looks. What did that mean? What truth? Garrison didn't understand either, and for the first time that entire evening, an emotion flickered across his face that she hadn't seen in a very long time. Utter bewilderment. He had expected tears, or screaming, or a dignified, head-held high retreat. He expected anything but this smile and these words, the meaning of which completely eluded him. Valerie picked up her clutch from the back of her chair. Calmly, without rushing, the way people pick up their bags when they are in no hurry because all the work is already done. She looked at Beatrice. No malice, no resentment, just a direct stare. Congratulate yourselves. I will be going. No one tried to stop her. Actually, several people stood up. Celeste, Francine, and 2 colleagues rose from their seats and followed her out. Silently, just walking beside her. That was the only thing she needed right then, to be flanked by people who refused to applaud. Outside, it was November. That distinct November air, cold and damp, plunging straight into the lungs and shocking the system back to reality. Valerie stopped by her car. She looked down at her hands on purpose, because she needed to know. Her hands were not shaking. Her fingers held the car keys perfectly steady. Celeste hugged her, tightly, without a word. Francine stood nearby, also silent. Francine knew how to share silence so that it didn't weigh you down, but held you up instead. Everything is fine, Valerie said. That is not a comfort, it's a statement of fact. She pulled out her phone, opened her contacts, and found Mitchell Prescott. He was standing maybe 15 feet away from her. She could see his silhouette under the glow of the street lamp. He had stepped outside right after her, just as they had arranged, without drawing attention. She called him anyway, because some things need to be spoken aloud to become real. Mitch, she said when he answered. That's it. Execute. He gave her a sharp nod from across the pavement and simultaneously spoke into the receiver. Understood. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. in my office. She put the phone away. Celeste was still holding her arm. Val, she said softly. I am perfectly fine, Valerie replied. Truly. Drive home, I'll give you a lift. No need, I'll drive myself. Celeste looked at her with a long, piercing gaze, the genuine, testing gaze reserved only for the oldest of friends, the ones you never have to pretend with. You knew this was going to happen for a long time, Celeste said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. A long time, Valerie confirmed. And you prepared. For 3 years, Valerie said simply. Just not for this specific evening. For what comes after. Celeste nodded slowly, wearing the expression of someone simultaneously stunned and completely unsurprised, because she knew exactly who she was dealing with and yet still marveled at the sheer scale of it. They hugged one more time. Valerie got into her car and started the engine. Francine knocked on the glass and Valerie rolled down the window. Call me in the morning, Francine ordered. I will, Valerie promised. She drove home. The roads were empty. Late evening, November, a work week. Street lamps reflected off the wet asphalt, and she thought about how Garrison was currently heading back to his guests, or, more likely, already leaving the restaurant, because it was far too awkward for him to stay after the birthday woman had walked out, and because the guests were not looking at him the way he had anticipated. He had anticipated understanding, sympathy, perhaps even respect for his bold honesty. He received absolute silence and lowered glasses. That must have shocked him. She knew this for a fact, because she knew exactly how his ego operated. He always considered himself a man who was easily forgiven. Silence greeted her at home, a silence she now perceived entirely differently, not as an empty void, but as a vast open space. Her own space, which owed nothing to anyone. She walked into her home office, flicked on the desk lamp, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out the folder. Dark brown, frayed, unlabeled. She didn't open it. She just placed it squarely on the desk in front of her and stared at it for a few seconds. Everything was in there. Everything was in its place. 3 years of work, meticulously filed by date. Then she put the folder back, closed the drawer, and texted Mitchell. Tomorrow at 9:00, I will be there. Her phone buzzed almost instantly. Garrison. She glanced at the screen and declined the call. It buzzed again. Declined again. The third call was an unknown number. She answered and heard Beatrice's voice, trembling with righteous indignation, yet still laced with that underlying layer of triumph that hadn't vanished. Do you have any idea what you've done? You publicly humiliated my son. You stormed out like a petulant little girl. Beatrice, Valerie said evenly, you are calling me at 11 o'clock at night. I have had a very long day. If you need to discuss Garrison's housing situation, call him. He handles those matters independently now. Good night. She hung up and switched the phone to silent. Then she lay down on the bed right in her dress, because she lacked the energy to change, and because the burgundy suited her, and she had no intention of associating it with this evening ever again. The dress was good, the evening was not. They were separate entities. She stared at the ceiling and thought, 32 years. 32 years next to a man who specifically chose her birthday dinner. She understood instantly, without a shred of doubt, that it wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't because it just happened that way, or because he hadn't thought it through. It was exactly because he had thought it through. A birthday dinner meant an audience, meant witnesses. It was a moment when she was supposed to appear more vulnerable than usual. The woman of the hour, the center of attention, holding a glass of wine, and then the ambush. He loved the dramatic effect. He always did. In his youth, it masqueraded as charisma. Now, it was glaringly obvious that it was merely a desperate need for spectators. She thought about Vanessa, the young woman at the back table with the rounding belly and the lost, anxious gaze. She didn't think of her with hatred, nor with pity, but rather with that specific, cold sympathy one feels for a person being let off a cliff without their knowledge. Vanessa believed she had secured a man with status, a luxury condo, robust business connections, and bright prospects. Vanessa had no idea who this man actually was. Financially, legally, fundamentally. She would find out. The only question was when and from whom. Valerie left that question open. For now, she closed her eyes, thinking about how tomorrow at 9 o'clock, Mitchell Prescott would open his copy of the folder, and they would march through every single item in order. The apartment, the lake house, the bank accounts, the loans, everything else. Every bullet point a separate conversation, a separate legal action, a separate document. The numbers added up. The numbers always added up. That much she knew for certain. Mitchell unlocked his office door at exactly 9 a.m. He always unlocked it at exactly 9. It was one of those character traits Valerie valued highly. Precision without the performative display of precision. It was just how the man functioned. It was just how he was wired. Coffee? He asked, taking off his overcoat. Yes, black. The office was compact but full of character. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, binders with color-coded spines, a desk in a state of perfect order that looked like chaos only to those who didn't understand the filing system. Valerie understood the system. They had collaborated for nearly 20 years. First by chance, then out of necessity, and finally out of a mutual trust that was worth more than any retainer agreement. He placed the coffee in front of her, sat across the desk, and opened the folder. The exact duplicate of the one sitting in Valerie's bottom drawer. Let's start with the most important asset, he said. The apartment. She nodded. The Gold Coast condo was purchased by Valerie before the marriage using inheritance funds from her mother. Sole owner, Valerie Sterling. No co-owners, no encumbrances. The mortgage had been paid off ages ago. Garrison was listed as a resident. That was the sole legal thread connecting him to the property. Residency status granted 0 ownership rights. He could have verified this at any point over the last 32 years. He just never bothered to check. Because people who are used to others doing the thinking for them rarely check the paperwork. Eviction notice, Mitchell stated. 14 days to vacate, the courier will deliver it to him today. Good. The lake house, he continued, turning the page. More complex in form, but bulletproof in substance. Transferred to your name a year ago via a deed in lieu of debt based on his promissory note. The debt is documented. The transfer of deed is executed. The county recorder's office reflects the update. Any attempt on his end to contest it would equal an admission of the original debt, which is financial suicide for him. Valerie nodded. She knew this already. They had discussed this exact mechanic 3 months ago, and again a month ago. But hearing it confirmed out loud, right here and now, it was necessary for absolute closure. The promissory notes. Mitchell pulled out the next sheet. A total of 2 substantial personal loans over the past 6 years. The total principal is significant. Notes written in his own hand. Copies notarized. Garrison's signature undeniable. One loan for a business venture of his that folded after 9 months. The second to cover a debt to a business partner when Garrison came home on a Sunday with shaking hands and a sum that needed to be paid out immediately. Valerie had handed over the money without lecturing, without ultimatums. She just wired the funds and filed the promissory note quietly and meticulously, exactly as she always did. The debt is moving to collections and enforcement, Mitchell said. Account freezes, wage garnishment, asset liens, standard protocol for a sum this large. When? 48 hours after filing. The courts will process the paperwork by the end of the week. Valerie took a sip of her coffee. There is one more detail, Mitchell said. His tone was even, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible note of anticipation that she caught perfectly. The personal account. Yes. You realize he has no idea it exists. That is precisely why he has no idea it exists, she replied. Mitchell gave a microscopic smirk. This account was opened in your name prior to the marriage. Funded strictly by your individual deposits, corporate bonuses, inheritance, payouts, and the sale of assets you owned prior to the marriage. Legally, it does not constitute marital property, even if the balance grew during the marriage, because the funding sources are demonstrably individual. We will need to prove the paper trail if necessary, but we have every single receipt to do so. Good. And lastly, Mitchell said, the item at the very back of the folder. She nodded. This was the most delicate bullet point, the one they had discussed the least. Not because it lacked leverage, but because it was an entirely different beast. The documents regarding that old state contracting scheme. The administrative statute of limitations had expired, yes. But there was the flip side. One of the players in that scheme had signed off on documents in a way that shifted a chunk of liability onto third parties who genuinely had no idea what they were authorizing. Among those third parties was a man who was still highly active in the commercial development sector, a man to whom the resurfacing of this story would be incredibly damaging even today. Not in terms of federal indictment, but in terms of industry reputation and current multi-million-dollar contracts. Garrison knew about this man, and this man knew about Garrison. Both stayed silent, because silence was profitable, but neither knew that Valerie knew about both of them. Mitchell had discreetly dug into it months ago. That particular developer would very much like for certain documents from that era to cease to exist. Valerie hadn't kept the copies for blackmail. She never operated on that wavelength. She kept them merely as an insurance policy, an argument that never needed to be spoken aloud in order to wield immense power. We are not touching this yet, she said. Yet, Mitchell agreed. But Garrison needs to realize that the sword is hanging over him. How exactly do you want to deliver the message? Through a settlement agreement, Valerie said. A peaceful, voluntary settlement where he fully acknowledges all his debt obligations and waives any and all claims to my assets. In exchange, I leave the subject at the back of the folder entirely unmentioned. Mitchell stared at her for a few seconds. Is it clean? Absolutely. No illegal extortion. Purely his own vested interest in ensuring certain papers stay exactly where they are. I am not threatening him. I am offering a transaction. Transparent and mutually beneficial. When? In a few days. Once he receives the eviction notice for the condo, the collection notices for the debt, and realizes he has zero legal standing, then we offer the settlement as his only exit strategy. Mitchell made a notation in his file. Understood, he said. We execute. She left the office at noon. Outside, it was a crisp, overcast November day. Slate skies, sparse pedestrians. Valerie walked toward her car and thought about how, just last night at the restaurant, Beatrice had proclaimed, "Finally, my son has earned a real family." 32 years. 32 years she had lived inside that woman's house, metaphorically speaking, orbiting her, enduring her calculating stares, driving to her place every single Sunday, managing her medical appointments, filing the paperwork for her senior care stipends, hauling groceries, and listening to endless monologues about what a real wife should be and why Garrison had no children. And all this time, Beatrice knew. She knew and said nothing. She either believed Valerie didn't deserve the truth, or that the truth belonged strictly to the real family, a family Valerie had never truly been a part of. Regardless of how many decades she had put in, Valerie thought about this without an ounce of bitterness, simply as a verified data point that needed to be factored into the equation. By evening, a text message arrived from Garrison. Lengthy. All caps at the beginning, then lowercase, then caps again. The digital footprint of a man who starts out trying to sound reasonable and progressively loses his temper. He wrote that her behavior was shameful, that she stormed out without talking, that he only wanted to be honest, and that they were mature adults who could resolve this humanely. The word humanely appeared 3 times. The phrase like a family twice. I am not your enemy. That appeared once, at the very end. Valerie read it, waited a few minutes, and typed a single sentence in response. All documentation is with my attorney. I strongly advise you to consult legal counsel. She didn't reply to anything else. Roxanne sent a voice memo. Valerie didn't bother listening to it. She swiped it straight to the archive. She put Beatrice's contact on Do Not Disturb. She didn't block her. She just chose to stop hearing her. This, too, was a deliberate decision. Not to slam doors shut with a deafening crash, but simply to quietly stop opening them. Celeste called that evening. How are you? She asked immediately. Working, Valerie said. Val, it is inhumane, Celeste said. To show up to your birthday party and pull a stunt like that. He needed an audience, Valerie replied. He always needed an audience for his major milestones. And you knew this? I knew he was going to do it, I just didn't have the exact date. The birthday dinner made logical sense. A rented venue, a large crowd, maximum dramatic yield. A pause. Doesn't it hurt? Celeste asked. I mean, truly hurt. Drop the I am perfectly fine routine, Valerie thought for a second. Honestly, with her guard down, it hurt in the past, back when I still hoped I was wrong. When I thought maybe this is just a phase, maybe I am imagining things. 3 years ago, it hurt. Now it is just the final chapter of a very long book I had already memorized. A climax you expect and prepare for doesn't destroy you the way an ambush does. You are terrifyingly brilliant, Val. Sometimes it scares me. It isn't brilliance, Valerie said. It's just data collection. 32 years is a massive sample size for behavioral observation. Celeste fell silent. He is going to get slaughtered, isn't he? She said. Slaughtered, Valerie agreed, void of any inflection. But not because I wish him harm. Simply because the laws of cause and effect operate independently of our wishes. He made his choices. Choices carry consequences. I didn't invent gravity. I simply stopped shielding him from the fall. That was the absolute truth, and she saw it with blinding clarity. Everything she had engineered over the past 3 years wasn't an offensive strike. It was the systematic removal of the safety nets she had silently provided for decades, simply because that was how their dynamic functioned. When she ceased to be his background noise, his reputational collateral, his financial safety cushion, his invisible rear guard, everything else was bound to collapse on its own. The way a structure crumbles when a critical load-bearing column is yanked out. She was the load-bearing column, he just didn't know it. Tomorrow, the education would begin. She hung up, went into the kitchen, and turned on the kettle. While waiting, she stood by the dark window, looking out at the November courtyard. A street lamp, wet asphalt, a sparse few pedestrians, someone's cat sitting on a bench with an air of absolute indifference to the world. The kettle clicked. She poured her tea, returned to her office, and opened her laptop. Not to draft a furious email to Garrison, not to write up complaints, but to draft an email to a corporate consulting firm that had been courting her to run their financial analytics division for months. Better compensation, engaging projects, zero office politics, which she had mapped out at her current firm down to the last decimal point. The managing director had been waiting for her answer for half a year. She kept delaying. It never felt like the right time. It felt like she needed to sort out one mess first, then another, then see how the chips fell. Now the chips had fallen. She typed smoothly, without backspacing. Outside, a fine drizzle was falling. Inside, it was warm, a cup of tea steaming on the desk. She was 58 years old, and she finally had the absolute right to make decisions exclusively for herself. She finished the email, proofread it, and hit send. The reply came 20 minutes later. Valerie, we are thrilled. See you on Monday. She closed the laptop, lay down, and shut her eyes. She didn't think about Garrison. She thought about how tomorrow morning, the collections agency would receive the debt filing. About how next week, she would start her new executive role. And about how somewhere out there was a small house with a wraparound porch that Celeste had shown her in a real estate listing last summer. Quiet, filled with light, with a view of something beautiful out the window. Back then she had thought, too soon. Now it wasn't too soon. She fell asleep quickly, sinking into a deep, dreamless slumber, the likes of which she hadn't experienced in years. That, too, was a choice. The following day, Garrison's business partner called. Bradley Thorne. They had been trying to launch a joint commercial real estate project for a few years. Valerie, he began cautiously. I heard about what happened. My deepest sympathies. Thank you, Bradley. I am calling because, tell me, do you plan to remain involved in our joint venture? Garrison assured us that many of the core financial strategies were vetted by you. No, Valerie said evenly. I have never officially been tied to Garrison's corporate entities. My professional interests have always remained entirely separate. A pause. I understand, he said. Well, I wish you the very best. She hung up and thought about it. He didn't call out of sympathy. He called to calculate whether it was worth staying in business with Garrison if Valerie Sterling was no longer part of the package deal. Because for years, Garrison Sterling had opened corporate doors by introducing himself as Valerie's husband. Her name, her sterling reputation, her flawless track record in the industry. All of it projected a halo effect that made him look infinitely more substantial than he actually was. The halo was gone. Doors were beginning to quietly swing shut. No dramatic explanations. They just stopped opening. She didn't have to lift a finger to make it happen. She simply removed herself from the equation. That was enough. 2 days after the party, a text arrived from Roxanne. A long paragraph written in that specific tone people adopt when they want to sound like the moral high ground while actually just lodging a bitter complaint. You are destroying the family. Garrison is a wreck. Mom isn't sleeping. Decent people don't behave this way. Valerie read it, didn't reply, and had a fleeting thought. Her definition of decency and Roxanne's were clearly operating in parallel universes. She archived the thread. Garrison called 4 times the day after the dinner, 3 times the second day, twice the third. Then, presumably, he finally got a hold of a lawyer, and the lawyer informed him that screaming into a voicemail was an incredibly poor litigation strategy. The phone calls stopped. They were replaced by text messages attempting to negotiate, then threatening, then attempting to negotiate again. Valerie ignored all of it. Only once, on the 6th day, did she type a single sentence. All documentation is with my attorney. Your counsel has his contact info. The luxury SUV that Garrison drove, assuming it was his, was also meticulously documented. Purchased during the marriage, but the down payment and the vast majority of the installments were wired directly from Valerie's individual account. The paper trail was pristine, legally qualifying the funds as a personal loan. Mitchell dispatched the asset seizure notice for the vehicle 3 days after the condo eviction notice. Pacing is key, Mitchell had explained. Give him a moment to catch his breath and convince himself the worst is over. Turns out it wasn't. A week after the birthday dinner, Valerie realized it was time for the next step. The one sitting at the back of her desk drawer. The one she and Mitchell had reviewed last, because it was the most critical, the most unexpected, and the most lethal piece of the puzzle she had assembled over 3 years. The one Garrison didn't know about, or rather, assumed she didn't know about. That was the crucial distinction, and the very crux of what was about to unfold. Vanessa called her first. Valerie hadn't expected it, though in truth, she hadn't ruled it out. A young pregnant woman facing an escalating barrage of red flags was bound to eventually seek out someone who could give her straight answers. Garrison clearly wasn't providing them. His mother and sister definitely wouldn't. That left the one woman who had known him for 32 years and who had walked out of her own birthday party with absolute composure, a purse on her shoulder, and a serene smile. Vanessa's voice was tight but not hostile. It carried the specific cadence of someone who had spent hours working up the courage and was now speaking rapidly before she lost her nerve. Valerie, I know this is a completely bizarre phone call. I don't know how you feel about me or how you'll react to my calling, but I desperately need to speak to someone who will tell me the actual truth. I am listening, Valerie said. He keeps saying everything is fine, that the housing issue is a misunderstanding being resolved, that the funds are tied up temporarily, that everything will work out. But I can see something is deeply wrong. His credit cards haven't worked for days. He claims it's a banking glitch. Last week, he tried to host a dinner with prospective investors, and his card was declined. I was sitting right there. It was... She paused, searching for the right word. It was humiliating for everyone. Valerie waited. I am pregnant, Vanessa continued. And packed into those 3 words was a mountain of exhaustion, terror, and a desperate attempt to cling to some shred of dignity. And I need to know exactly what kind of situation I am bringing a child into. The reality, not the fairy tale he keeps feeding me. All right, Valerie said after a short pause. Meet me tomorrow. The cafe on Michigan Avenue. You know the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows? At noon? Yes, I'll be there. Valerie arrived 5 minutes early and asked the hostess to seat the young woman when she arrived, as Valerie was already at a table. Not as a power play, but because observing a person for a few seconds before the formal introduction reveals far more than the first 5 minutes of conversation. Valerie was accustomed to evaluating people based on how they acted when they thought no one was watching. Vanessa arrived exactly at noon. She sat by the window and stared out at the street. Not at her phone, but at the street. That immediately signaled something important. A person who can just sit and observe the world without frantically scrolling to fill the silence possesses a rich internal life. Her face was a mix of exhaustion and intense focus, lacking both arrogance and subservience. Her pregnancy was clearly visible now. 6 months. Valerie's visual estimate had been spot on. Valerie approached the table. Vanessa turned, and for a few seconds, they just looked at each other in silence, skipping the superficial pleasantries. "Vanessa," Valerie said. "I'm Valerie. I know who you are." "I know," Vanessa replied. They sat down. The waiter brought menus. Valerie ordered a black coffee. Vanessa ordered herbal tea. They waited in silence until the drinks arrived. Outside the glass, the bustling Chicago street rushed by Gray, hurried, apathetic. "I won't pretend this is a casual chat," Valerie said once the waiter retreated. "And I won't say what you probably braced yourself to hear. I didn't come here to scream at you, and I didn't come here to beg for anything. I came to provide you with data, because I firmly believe a person has the right to make life-altering decisions based on factual reality." Vanessa looked at her intently, evaluating, but entirely devoid of malice. "I am listening," she said. Valerie pulled a slim manila folder from her tote bag and placed it on the table. She didn't open it. Just set it down. Garrison Sterling, 48 years old. Director of procurement at a mid-tier commercial construction firm. His verified annual salary is right here. She tapped the folder with one finger. "You can review it yourself when you're ready." "How much?" Vanessa asked, bluntly, cutting to the chase. A good sign. $95,000 a year pre-tax. Valerie took a sip of her coffee. "Did he ever disclose his actual income to you?" Vanessa's expression shifted. Very subtly, but Valerie caught it. The look of someone who just heard a number drastically lower than the one they had been banking on. "He said he was a high earner, that everything would be taken care of, that he had massive earning potential," she said slowly. "He never gave a specific number. Specific numbers are rarely volunteered when they are inconvenient," Valerie stated neutrally. "Also in this folder is a certified ledger of his outstanding debts to me. It is a legally binding sum that is currently being processed by collections and the courts. That is why his credit cards are declining. It isn't a banking glitch. It is a court-ordered freeze on his assets pending wage garnishment. Given the sheer size of the debt, a massive chunk of his paycheck will be withheld to cover the arrears for years to come." Vanessa reached for the folder, opened it, and began to read. Slowly, methodically, without rushing. Valerie drank her coffee and waited. She knew how to wait. "He doesn't own any property," Vanessa finally said. It wasn't a question. It was the dawn of comprehension. "He does not," Valerie confirmed. "The Gold Coast condo where he resided for the last 32 years belongs exclusively to me. Sole ownership. Purchased with inheritance money before we ever married. He was served an eviction notice. From what I gather, he is currently crashing at his mother's place. The SUV he drives is being repossessed to settle a fraction of his debt to me. The lake house in Wisconsin, which he loved to call our family estate, is deeded entirely in my name. Legally ironclad. Zero loopholes." Vanessa closed the folder and looked up. "Why are you telling me all this?" she asked. "Do you want me to leave him?" Valerie paused for a second. It was a fair question, and it demanded an honest answer. "No," she said. "I genuinely do not care if you leave him or stay with him. That is your life and your choice. I am telling you this because you are pregnant and planning to build a life with this man. You need to know exactly who he is financially and legally, so your expectations align with reality, rather than the fiction he sold you." Vanessa stared into her teacup for a long time. "He told me he had a massive portfolio of investments," she finally whispered. "He said we were going to rent a luxury penthouse, that he had untouchable industry connections, that everything would be perfect." "There is no portfolio," Valerie said, gently but firmly. "And the industry connections he possessed were largely sustained by my name and my professional reputation in the sector. I am no longer providing that halo effect. This isn't a death sentence. People survive on far less and build lives from scratch. But you need to know exactly what your starting line looks like, so you can walk into this with your eyes wide open." "He told me you two made roughly the same amount of money," Vanessa said quietly. Valerie raised a single eyebrow. "No," she said. "My annual performance bonus eclipsed his entire base salary. I'm not saying this to brag or to diminish him. It is simply a verified data point you need if you want to understand the true mechanics of the situation you are currently trapped in." Vanessa fell silent. The cafe hummed around them. Chatter, clinking silverware, background jazz that no one was listening to. Just an ordinary city afternoon. I didn't know, she finally said. I didn't know any of it. I know you didn't. Valerie finished her coffee, stood up, and slipped into her trench coat. Are you angry with me? No, Vanessa said, and it sounded completely genuine. You are the only person who has actually told me the truth. Valerie pulled a sleek business card from her bag and slid it across the table. This is a family law attorney. She is exceptionally sharp. I've known her for years. If you need a consultation regarding child support, prenatal rights, or financial security during your pregnancy, call her. Tell her Valerie sent you. The initial consultation is fully covered. Vanessa looked at the card, then up at Valerie. Why are you doing this? Because the child is innocent, Valerie said simply. She walked out the door. The biting November wind hit her face. Sharp, bracing, honest, just the way it should be. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing it in. Vanessa was not the enemy. Valerie had understood that from the very beginning. She was just a young woman who had been conned into believing in a mirage. It wasn't her fault she was fed a lie. Her only responsibility now was what she chose to do with the truth. Valerie left that entirely in her hands, stepping away without interference. She walked to her car, her mind shifting gears to the conversation scheduled for tomorrow. A totally different kind of conversation, the one she had saved for last, because it was the end game. The conversation where the truth mentioned at the very beginning of this saga would finally be laid bare. The truth Garrison believed was his most guarded secret, the secret he had buried so carefully. The secret Valerie had known about for years, tracking every detail, hoarding every document, while he lived in blissful ignorance of her awareness. That was the ultimate checkmate. That was what lay at the very bottom of the folder. She called Mitchell the moment she got into her car. Mitch, are we ready for tomorrow? Always ready, he said. I have the finalized agreement right here. Whenever you want to bring him in. Tomorrow evening, Valerie said. I am going to call him tonight. Tell him I need to talk. That I think I overreacted and I want to settle this amicably. Pause. Will he buy it? He will want to buy it, she corrected. There's a psychological difference, but practically speaking, the outcome is the same. Garrison answered on the third ring. Not out of reluctance, but because judging by the heavy silence before he spoke, he was genuinely stunned. She hadn't reached out in 10 days. Valerie, he said cautiously, like a man navigating a minefield. Garrison, she said, her voice pitched just a fraction softer than usual, laced with a calculated exhaustion that sounded like a concession. We need to talk, I think. I think I was too harsh. We need to sit down and handle this like adults. Humanely. No lawyers, no court summons, no couriers. Just a conversation. Can you come over tomorrow at 7? A pause. He was processing. Just us? He asked. Just us, she assured him. It's a family matter. We don't need an audience. He showed up. Of course he showed up. She knew he would, because over 32 years, she had mapped his psychological circuitry down to the last wire. He came because he heard exactly what his ego demanded to hear in her voice. Fatigue, surrender, a willingness to compromise, a golden ticket out of the mess he had created. He only ever heard what he wanted to hear. It was a fatal flaw she had observed for decades, entirely stripped of any illusions. He walked into the condo projecting cautious optimism, though she could tell his guard was already lowering. He swept the room with that familiar, possessive gaze that had annoyed her so deeply over the last few years. He looked at the apartment as if he owned it, even though his name had never been on the deed. Valerie had set the dining table, neatly but without flair. Just 2 mugs, a teapot, nothing fancy. She kept the lighting dim and wore a simple, dark cashmere sweater, not dressing up, but not looking careless either. A neutral, domestic middle ground. She had cleared the table of clutter. The settlement agreement lay beneath a stack of mundane mail hidden in plain sight. They sat down. She poured the tea and slid his mug toward him. He took it, a reflexive, ingrained habit. 32 years across the same table. I am glad you came, she said, her voice steady but carrying a microscopic tremor she engineered perfectly. I have been doing a lot of thinking. Litigation is endless. It drains bank accounts and destroys whatever is left of our sanity. I don't want that. I want us to settle this peacefully, like civilized people. Garrison's posture visibly relaxed. She saw his shoulders drop exactly 1 inch, and that inch was a monumental victory. Valerie, I am so relieved you see it that way, he said, and his voice immediately regained that arrogant timbre that surfaced whenever he believed he had wrestled back control of a situation. We can find a compromise that works for everyone. I don't want to ruin you. You know that. That is precisely why I asked you here, Valerie said. The bank requires signatures to finalize a voluntary asset division without a judge. It expedites everything. Saves us both thousands in legal fees. No courtrooms, no public records. She pulled the settlement agreement from beneath the mail, flipped to the signature page, and slid it across the mahogany table. It's boilerplate legal jargon. Take a look. The document was drafted by Mitchell Prescott with terrifying legal precision. Standard Times New Roman font, dense formatting, incredibly dull subheadings. It was engineered specifically for a man who never read the fine print, who skimmed the first paragraph and just looked for the dotted line. Paragraph 1 contained a number, the exact sum of his debt, printed in bold ink. Next to it was the word acknowledgement. Garrison read the first sentence and froze at the number. That is the debt you are voluntarily acknowledging, Valerie said evenly. In exchange, I agree not to escalate matters that could severely jeopardize your future. Garrison looked up, eyes narrowing. What matters? Valerie stood up, walked to her desk, opened the bottom drawer, and retrieved the second folder. The one he had snooped through in August. But evidently, he hadn't read to the end. Or he had, but was too legally illiterate to grasp what he was holding. She placed it on the table right in front of him. Flip to the last page, she ordered. He opened it. He stared at it. For 5 agonizing seconds, his face was entirely blank, and then it shifted. The transformation was dramatic, yet physically microscopic. A man who, 60 seconds ago, believed he was steering the ship, had just crashed headfirst into an iceberg he never saw coming. Where did you get this? He choked out. His voice was entirely different. Stripped of bass, stripped of swagger, stripped of everything. 30 years in corporate financial analytics, Garrison, Valerie said. Did you genuinely believe I wouldn't notice? On the final page were photocopies, not just the municipal code violations regarding the old state bids. That was just the surface noise. The real leverage was deeper. 3 years ago, Garrison had orchestrated an embezzlement scheme. Valerie hadn't stumbled upon it by accident. She had mapped it out, step by step, tracing the forensic accounting trail with the lethal precision she had honed over 3 decades of balancing corporate ledgers. The scheme wasn't particularly genius, just stealthy. He had leveraged her name, not her signature, but her sterling reputation and back-channel industry clout to secure endorsements for several massive municipal development bids. But that was just layer 1. Layer 2 was the kill shot. Arthur Gable, the veteran auditor she had quietly deployed 3 years ago, had cracked it. A massive chunk of the federal funds allocated from one of those winning bids had been funneled out through a ghost LLC, a shell company registered to a dummy director. It was textbook money laundering, relatively clumsy to a trained eye, but highly effective in a poorly regulated environment. Garrison was a documented beneficiary. The paper trail of wire transfers was undeniable. The statute of limitations on the municipal zoning infractions was dead, true. But the federal wire fraud and embezzlement? That clock was still ticking, and there was a secondary blast radius. One of the key players who signed off on those doctored invoices currently held a high-ranking political office on the state infrastructure board. If these documents leaked not even to the feds, but to the press or a rival political campaign, it would trigger a catastrophic federal indictment. That politician knew Garrison was involved. Garrison knew the politician was involved. Mutually assured destruction kept them quiet, but neither of them realized Valerie had the launch codes. That was the truth she had teased at the birthday dinner. You weaponized my professional reputation without my consent, Valerie said, sitting back down across from him. The administrative violations are largely expired, yes. But the wire fraud? That is a very different beast. She tapped the final page with a manicured fingernail. Do you see that name? Do you understand the magnitude of the fallout if this dossier leaves this room? Garrison stared at the papers. He was dead silent. There was no defiance left, no triumphant smirks. Just the hollowed-out stare of a man who realized he had been playing checkers against a grandmaster who had anticipated his next 50 moves. What do you want? He finally asked, quietly. No aggression. A genuine plea for terms of surrender. I want exactly what is already legally mine, Valerie said. The condo is mine, the lake house is mine. You will sign the voluntary acknowledgement of your massive debt, and the courts will garnish your wages on a fixed schedule. You waive any and all phantom claims to my personal investment accounts. You sign the out-of-court asset division right now. In exchange, the documents at the back of this folder never see the light of day. He sat in silence for a very long time. Longer than she anticipated. You plotted this for years, he finally said. Not with anger, but with a bizarre sort of awe. A statement of absolute fact. 3 years, Valerie corrected. Though the red flags started piling up long before that. Did you always know? Not always. But once I started crunching the numbers, the math exposed everything rather quickly. Numbers don't lie, Garrison. It is the one characteristic of my profession I have always deeply appreciated. A heavy pause hung in the air. I thought you. He started, but the words died in his throat. You thought I didn't notice, she finished for him. Or that I noticed but would swallow it to keep the peace. Or that I was simply too terrified of being alone to do anything about it. She leveled a glacial stare at him. None of the above. I stayed silent because I was waiting for the optimal moment to strike. The moment is here. He picked up the heavy brass pen. He read the settlement agreement. Truly read it this time. Slowly, agonizingly, page by page. Valerie waited. She knew how to wait. The silence didn't suffocate her, didn't trigger anxiety. It was just a countdown clock running out of seconds. He signed it. Valerie pulled the document back, slipped it into a pristine envelope, and sealed it. Mitchell Prescott will have this on his desk by 8:00 a.m., she said. He retains the original. Garrison stood up. He lingered by the table for a second, looking like a man who desperately wanted to say something profound but realized he had entirely run out of script. Finally, he spoke, not maliciously, not bitterly, but with a raw, shattered honesty. You never once told me you were miserable all these years. You never once asked, she replied. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man who had absolutely no counter-argument. He grabbed his wool coat and walked out. The heavy oak door clicked shut without a slam. Quietly. The way doors close when a story has definitively ended and the credits are rolling. Valerie stood in the foyer for a moment. The scent of his cologne was already fading. The silence in the apartment had fundamentally shifted. It wasn't the silence of someone having just left a room. It was the silence of an era ending. She walked back into her office and dialed Mitchell. Signed. I have the master copy. I'll courier it to you in the morning. Outstanding, Mitchell said. A brief pause, his voice dropping a register into something remarkably tender. Valerie, do you realize you just successfully executed a 3-year covert operation? I realize it, she said. How do you feel? She genuinely analyzed it, not for polite conversation, but for herself. I feel tranquil, Mitch. I probably should feel something more chaotic rage, grief, or at least a rush of vindictive triumph. But I just feel deeply calm. It's almost surreal. Maybe, Mitchell mused slowly. That is the ultimate proof that you did the exact right thing. When a person aligns their actions with their core truth, the result is profound peace. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. She didn't offer a philosophical reply. She just thanked him and ended the call. The following week, she started her new executive role. The CEO greeted her with that specific, understated satisfaction that occurs when a brilliant strategic hire finally signs on. No exaggerated fanfare, just the quiet thrill of snapping the final puzzle piece into place. The team was lean, brilliant, and utterly devoid of the toxic corporate politicking that had drained half her life force at her previous job. They looked at her as a vital leader they had been anticipating, not just a body filling a head count. Valerie had cultivated a sixth sense for corporate culture, and she recognized she had struck gold within the first hour. Celeste called that evening. Well, it is excellent, Valerie said. Truly excellent. And the paperwork? Did he sign? He signed everything. No resistance. What did his face look like when he walked out? Valerie pondered for a second. Like a man who realized he spent his entire life bringing a plastic butter knife to a gunfight, she said dryly. It wasn't joyous or tragic. It was just the logical conclusion to a mathematical equation. Did you show him the federal leverage? I let him read it. I didn't need to explain it. The panic in his eyes was sufficient. Celeste laughed in disbelief. Valerie, you know what has always astounded me about you? You are the only human being on planet Earth capable of orchestrating a 3-year, high-stakes legal assassination, while simultaneously driving over to your mother-in-law's house every Sunday with a casserole and smiling through corporate holiday parties. It wasn't an assassination, Valerie corrected softly. It was just life. You don't pause your entire existence just because you're preparing for a hurricane. The world keeps spinning. You are an impossible woman, Celeste said warmly. That is a compliment, by the way. In late November, Valerie drove over to Beatrice's house unannounced. Her former mother-in-law opened the door, her face twisting into a familiar mask, a blend of bracing for a dramatic confrontation and profound disappointment that the confrontation wasn't going to be theatrical enough. Valerie, Beatrice sneered. Beatrice, Valerie said coolly, stepping past her into the living room without waiting for an invitation. I am here to collect my property and resolve an administrative technicality. She walked straight into the den. In the corner sat a high-end orthopedic recliner. Valerie had purchased it 3 years ago when Beatrice's arthritis flared up. Next to it was an electronic blood pressure monitor, replacing a faulty analog one. On the bookshelf sat several expensive first edition novels Valerie had tracked down and gifted her over the years. Every single item had been purchased with Valerie's personal credit card. She had retained the receipts, because she always retained the receipts. "What on earth are you doing?" Beatrice snapped, watching Valerie systematically unplug the blood pressure monitor and drop it into her leather tote. "This is my property," Valerie stated. "Purchased with my funds. The receipts are filed. A moving company will be here tomorrow at 9:00 a.m. to extract the recliner. Make sure the path to the door is clear." "You are repossessing a medical device from an ailing old woman?" Beatrice gasped, deploying that specific theatrical octave she used when she fully expected her opponent to immediately crumble in guilt. "Beatrice," Valerie said, her voice never rising above a conversational hum. "For 18 years you looked me in the eye and told me a daughter-in-law is not blood, that your son was your only real family, and that I was nothing more than a temporary guest in your dynasty. You were absolutely right. I am officially adopting your worldview. I am a stranger, and strangers take their belongings with them when they leave." Beatrice was paralyzed. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, she was genuinely speechless. No snide remarks, no guilt trips, no dramatic monologues, because there was no counter-argument. Every single grievance she could possibly weaponize, she had already systematically dismantled herself over the past 18 years. Valerie walked out of the apartment and paused on the landing for a microsecond. 18 years of stolen Sundays. 18 years of highway traffic, dragging groceries, managing pharmacy runs, filing Medicare paperwork, enduring suffocating conversations that were obligations on her end and entitlements on the other. She exhaled. Not a heavy sigh, just a clearing of the lungs. She felt the distinct physical sensation of dropping a 100-pound rucksack she had carried for so long she had forgotten what gravity felt like without it. She took the stairs down to the street, slid into the driver's seat, pulled out her phone, and dialed the Department of Human Services. "Good afternoon. I need to formally revoke my status as a registered primary caregiver for a Medicaid beneficiary. The citizen is Beatrice Sterling. I am no longer legally affiliated with her, and I am immediately terminating all in-home caregiving duties. Please update your registry to reflect the cessation of the state-funded caregiver stipend." The operator placed her on a brief hold, then asked her to verify the Social Security numbers. The entire bureaucratic procedure took exactly 12 minutes. It was perfectly legal. The monthly state stipend was disbursed under the strict condition that Valerie provided active, verifiable care. Valerie was no longer providing it. Therefore, the financial pipeline had to be severed. She executed the termination flawlessly, remaining rigidly within the confines of the law. It mattered to her not just financially, but on a cosmic scale. She put the phone down and put the car in drive. She thought about the moment Beatrice would realize her monthly caregiving stipend had evaporated. No sooner, no later. It wasn't cruelty, it was physics. Cause and effect are linked as inevitably as debits and credits on a balance sheet. If one side of the ledger is wiped out, the other side zeroes out automatically. In December, Valerie flew down south. Celeste had forwarded her the contact info for a luxury real estate broker in Charleston, South Carolina, the very same broker who had texted her those listing photos last summer. Valerie emailed her in early December, ready to tour properties. The broker replied within the hour, attaching a curated dossier. Valerie shortlisted 2. One in a bustling coastal enclave, the other slightly further from the tourist traps, boasting a sprawling garden. She flew out alone, caught a morning flight out of O'Hare, and checked into a boutique hotel overlooking the Battery by sunset. The Atlantic Ocean in December wasn't the postcard-perfect summer fantasy. It was slate gray, windswept, and wildly alive. Exactly the aesthetic she craved. The first property was objectively gorgeous but lacked a soul. Massive, sterile, featuring a chef's kitchen that felt like a surgical theater. Something about the scale of it felt alien. It wasn't her rhythm. The broker, a sharp 50-something woman who operated with ruthless efficiency and zero fluff, instantly read the room and didn't push. The second property was a revelation. A historic, modest colonial with whitewashed brick, a deep wraparound mahogany porch, and a backyard shaded by ancient, weeping live oaks draped in Spanish moss. A magnolia tree and a smattering of dormant hydrangeas promised an explosion of color come spring. The view from the porch was unparalleled. A slice of the horizon, the marshlands fading into the distance, beneath a pale winter sky. It was profoundly quiet. Not desolate, but deeply serene. That specific brand of quiet where you can hear the ocean breathing, even if you can't see the breakers. The salt was heavy in the air, a scent impossible to mistake for anything else. Valerie stood on the mahogany planks, gripping the railing, staring at the horizon. She remembered how the ocean smelled at dawn. She remembered it from a road trip decades ago. In her mid-20s, long before Garrison entered the picture, back when the entire universe felt like an open door. It felt that way because it was. It was just that life had gotten cluttered with obligations that consumed her time and hijacked her airspace, forcing her to abandon that salty air even in her daydreams. Now, she was reclaiming it. "I'll take it," she told the broker. The woman nodded, entirely unfazed, radiating the icy professionalism of an agent who knows exactly how to differentiate between a casual tourist and an apex predator closing a kill. The deed was finalized by the end of December. Mitchell Prescott reviewed the closing disclosures over the phone. He trusted her implicit financial literacy, but his paranoid lawyer instincts demanded he verify the fine print. "Ironclad," he said gruffly. "I know," she replied. On New Year's Eve, Celeste showed up at Valerie's Chicago condo with a bottle of vintage Napa Cabernet and a decadent chocolate torte from the artisanal bakery they had frequented for 20 years. They sat at the kitchen island. Celeste was recounting an absurdly funny disaster from her consulting firm. Valerie sipped the Cabernet, listened, and had an epiphany. This is what had been missing for over 3 decades. Not a husband that was a separate, cleanly amputated chapter. Just this. Sitting in a kitchen, entirely unhurried, drinking wine with a brilliant friend, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow morning required 0 explanations, 0 compromises, and 0 emotional labor. "Do you ever think about him?" Celeste asked softly, midway through the second glass. Occasionally, Valerie answered with brutal honesty, but not with a sense of loss. More like an archaeological artifact. Something that was a massive structural component of my history, but has ceased to be relevant to my present. 32 years is a staggering amount of time. He is a part of my hard drive, whether I like it or not. The difference is, that specific partition is no longer dictating my operating system. Do you have any regrets? About what exactly? About the way everything detonated. Valerie analyzed the question, not to formulate a witty comeback, but to search her own soul. "No," she stated firmly. "And not because I possess a heart of stone, or because the betrayal didn't gut me. It gutted me exactly when it was supposed to years ago. I bled out silently, internally, while maintaining perfect optics for the rest of the world. By the time the grand finale arrived, the pain had evaporated. The only thing left was absolute clarity. Surgical precision," Celeste murmured. "Exactly," Valerie agreed. "The surgical precision of a player who has finally seen everyone's cards. Once you possess the full dataset, the next steps calculate themselves. The truth is incredibly liberating." They raised their glasses. A toast to the new year, a toast to the executive suite, a toast to a mahogany porch and a slice of the Atlantic horizon, a toast to the silence that she finally owned outright, a toast to 18 years of stolen Sundays that would never be hijacked again, and a toast to the undeniable fact that life was breathtakingly good. In January, Valerie relocated. Not in a manic frenzy, but with the systematic precision that defined her existence. First, she dispatched the freight pods, then her personal luggage. Finally, herself. She leased the Gold Coast condo through a premium management agency. High net worth zip code, pristine renovations, premium rental yield. Yet another passive revenue stream generating capital while she slept. She spent her final night in the Chicago apartment entirely alone. Echoing rooms, stripped shelving, the phantom scent of a space transitioning back to neutrality, preparing to absorb a stranger's life. Valerie walked the perimeter unhurriedly. She touched the drywall, looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, stood in the kitchen where a kettle had whistled every morning for 32 years. She didn't mourn. She simply paid her respects. A quiet, dignified farewell to a shell she had unequivocally outgrown. At dawn, she locked the deadbolt, handed the brass key to the property manager, and ordered a black car to Union Station. Her Amtrak sleeper car departed at 10:00 a.m. She sat by the panoramic window, watching the jagged Chicago skyline shrink into the rear view. Brutal, steel gray, deeply familiar, colossal. She thought about how, in a matter of hours, the topography outside the glass would fundamentally alter. A different atmosphere, a different dawn. She thought about the new firm. The inaugural projects were already launching. Her colleagues had proven to be exactly who they appeared to be during the interview. Razor-sharp, direct, allergic to bureaucracy. She thought about the mahogany porch and the ocean. This was not a retreat. A retreat is fleeing a burning building with no destination in mind. This was an arrival. Navigating toward coordinates she had possessed all along, just waiting for the exact right moment to punch them into the GPS. She had arrived. The scenery blurred outside the glass. Industrial sprawl gave way to frozen plains, dense pine forests, and sprawling farmland buried under pristine, undisturbed snow. Valerie watched the continent roll by, a profound realization settling over her. Hitting 58 was not an epilogue. It wasn't a summary. It was merely the prologue to a sequel. Not objectively superior or inferior to the original, just entirely her own. A new architecture constructed on a bedrock she had poured, cured, and reinforced over 3 grueling years of absolute silence. The foundation was indestructible. She knew this with mathematical certainty. She could stand on it, jump on it, and it would never crack. Mitchell Prescott called her while the train was tearing through the American heartland. Valerie. Vanessa just filed a petition for prenatal child support and emergency alimony. Celia Montgomery is representing her. Excellent, Valerie said. Do you have any regrets about sliding her that business card? Zero, she replied. The child is innocent. That is the one indisputable axiom I have maintained since the first domino fell. A pause. You know, Mitchell said, his voice thick with admiration, you simultaneously orchestrated 3 overlapping, phenomenally complex legal maneuvers. 99% of the population lacks the bandwidth for that. I am an executive analyst, Mitch, Valerie said. Multitasking is in my job description. He laughed. A short, warm bark. Safe travels, Valerie. Thank you, Mitch. She disconnected the call and rested her temple against the cool glass. The train hurtled south. The sky outside began to shift, trading the brutal Midwest gray for something softer, brighter, less punishing. A few more hours, and she would hit the coast. She had an epiphany, something that only crystallized here, in transit, when the wreckage was fully in the rear view and she could finally evaluate her masterpiece without the adrenaline blinding her. Garrison had genuinely believed that dropping a nuclear bomb at her birthday dinner would shatter her. That the sheer public humiliation of being discarded in front of 40 peers, holding a wine glass on her special day, would expose her soft underbelly. He expected maximum psychological devastation. He expected her to be completely unarmed. He lacked one crucial piece of data. He didn't know that she had spent 3 years meticulously engineering this exact climax. That every month, every spreadsheet hidden in that brown folder, every encrypted phone call with Mitchell Prescott, every notarized document quietly slipping through the legal system, it was all ammunition, hoarded and polished specifically so that when the curtain finally dropped, she could simply stand up, pick up her clutch, and walk out. Without a single tear. Without a raised voice. Without a dramatic meltdown. Leaving behind a single lethal sentence that 40 people in that room would remember for the rest of their natural lives. Well, I have been preparing for this day for a very long time. Now it is your turn to learn the truth. The truth wasn't a singular entity. It was a multi-warhead missile, and each payload detonated exactly on schedule. First, the condo, then the lake house, then the crushing debt, and finally, the radioactive dossier buried at the bottom of the drawer. Layers of armor systematically stripped away one by one. Methodical, flawless, unhurried. That is how a surgical scalpel operates. No fireworks, no explosive thunder. Just a flawless incision right down the dotted line. The train barreled south. The sky cracked open, flooding the cabin with blinding light. Waiting for her was a mahogany porch, a sliver of the horizon, and the scent of the Atlantic Ocean she had locked in her memory for 2 decades. It was finally re-entering her atmosphere, not as a ghost of a memory, but as her morning reality, her breakfast view, her oxygen, and that distinct, rhythmic crashing of the waves that cannot be mistaken for anything else on the planet, because there is absolutely nothing else like it. Valerie Sterling closed her eyes and smiled. Not a cold, calculated smile. A real one.